Don't stop.
Jimmy Kimmel has been the pace setter. He's the new pope of the left, according to Guy Benson, a good label, I think. And Jimmy Kimmel apparently appeared at he apparently appeared at some event for Pod Save America. So last week, you remember, I criticized Stephen Colbert for having on Pod Save America after the State of the Union, because Stephen Colbert would never have me on after a State of the Union by a Democrat or a Republican. We have about the same size audience. Jimmy Kimmel obviously had to outdo his compatriot in leftist terms because he is the new pope. And so he actually said at this event, quote, "It just so happens that almost every talk show host is a liberal, and that's because it requires a level of intelligence." So according to Jimmy Kimmel, the reason that he and his fellow talk show hosts are on the left is because they're smart, you see. It's not because they have a certain point of view and they all live in a bubble and they've all lived in big cities most of their lives. It's not because they spend all of their time hanging out with other people on the left and never have a dissenting conversation. It's not any of that stuff. It's just because they're so smart, you see. Right? Because Jimmy Kimmel, like on a pure IQ test, I'm sure Jimmy Kimmel, a guy who had women feel his crotch on national TV, would outdo me, I think, for example. I think when it comes to talk show hosts, put Jimmy Kimmel next to Dennis Miller. I'm sure that Jimmy Kimmel wildly outdoes Dennis Miller, a conservative. And there are a bunch of people saying, well, isn't he right? Aren't all the talk show hosts on the left? Well, no. The most successful talk show host of the last 35 years was Jay Leno, and Jay Leno is center-right. Jay Leno's a libertarian. So, no, this is stupidity all the way up. And it's so smug and it's so smarmy. And then you wonder why the culture is being torn apart. Like Jimmy Fallon showed up at the Super Bowl. And one of the things that happened, I'm not sure if they showed it on TV, they showed it at the game. There's a shot of him, and he kind of made a joke where he spilled water all over himself. And it was charming, and it was funny. Right? And then after the game, Jimmy Kimmel has to join in the race to the political bottom. Like, whatever you think of Trump, you don't have to like Trump. But turning this into everything has to be a partisan fight, turning our late-night show hosts into partisan fighters who can't make a joke about Barack Obama for 8 years and then can't stop making jokes about Trump, but not even jokes, just nasty riffs. How does that unify the country in any serious way? Serious criticisms of Trump, I'm perfectly willing to hear, although not from the likes of Jimmy Kimmel, who does not know what he's talking about on virtually any issue. We've debunked him 1,000 times on the show at this point.
Kimmel says, "It just so happens that almost every talk show host is a liberal, and that's because, wait for it, it requires a level of intelligence." This is a guy who makes a living by saying other people's words into a camera and being applauded no matter what he says. And whenever he does use his own thoughts, he's proven to be almost 180 degrees wrong. His rant on Obamacare, the example he used, had nothing to do with the issue and was just emotional. Kimmel and people like him only appeal to the emotions. They cannot compete in the arena of ideas alone. They're too stupid to even realize that. And without their props and their glossy shows and their expensive TV sets, left to stand alone in the marketplace of ideas, they will fail.
To call Devin Nunes Donald Trump's lapdog would be an insult to dogs and laps. He's not a lapdog. He's more of a retriever. Here, boy, go write me a memo to smear the FBI. Good boy.
Jimmy Kimmel unleashing on House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes for writing the memo alleging surveillance abuse by the FBI and the Department of Justice. Kimmel attacking conservatives as well during a progressive podcast over the weekend. He said that almost every TV talk show host in late night is liberal because that requires a level of intelligence. Let's bring in our media panel. Joe Concha is media reporter for The Hill. Judy Miller, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, author, and Fox News contributor. So, Judy, this podcast is something that was put together by a bunch of former Obama administration officials. They invited Jimmy Kimmel on, and he says that if you're going to be a TV talk show host in late night, you got to be intelligent, and therefore conservatives need not apply. What do you think?
Well, Jimmy Kimmel finally said something funny, or at least liberals will find it funny. Conservatives just find it predictable and outrageous. I think Jimmy Kimmel should be working at MSNBC, which has an obviously anti-Trump, left-of-center, open and obvious point of view. But, you know, look, I may agree with Jimmy Kimmel on the sorry state of our health care system, and I may agree that our gun laws are outrageous, but I think that suggesting that people who are conservative are not intelligent is just over the top, over the line, outrageous, and it smacks of the smug satisfaction that helped elect Donald Trump. So I hope the Hillary Clinton viewers are happy, but for everybody else, take note. This kind of smugness really is is going to backfire.
One way, Joe, to ensure that you don't last long in network television is to insult half your audience.
Well, yeah, I like what Kimmel said. He said, it requires a certain level of intelligence. Actually, it requires a certain level of conformity. In other words, if I watch Kimmel or Colbert or Trevor Noah or Sam Bee, it's all the same thing. Judy Kurtz, who is a writer over at The Hill, she wrote a great story last week that said, is television headed for a dump on Trump overload? And, perhaps we are, because how many times can we just do the same thing, one trick pony over and over again? But to Judy's point, where she says she agrees with Jimmy Kimmel on healthcare, she's not agreeing with Jimmy Kimmel. Oh, no. According to the Daily Beast, last year they did a great report that Kimmel actually gets his talking points for his monologue, particularly on healthcare, directly from Chuck Schumer's office. Could you imagine Johnny Carson getting talking points from Daniel Patrick Moynihan? I mean, Carson didn't keep it political, and I think that's why he didn't lose half his audience, and that's probably a good thing. But Kimmel's already said, John, I don't care if Trump supporters watch. I could take him or leave him, don't need him, and that's the way things are going now in late night. They're only appealing to half the country. They don't seem to care.
Yeah. Right. Judy, there weren't a lot of Barack Obama jokes that Jimmy Kimmel passed along.
No, and I mean this kind of openly political, openly partisan late-night talk show host is what's driving young people away from late-night TV and towards social media, less and less towards television. And, I think that people like Kimmel, he's talking to his audience, which is liberal, and if he wants to write off half of the country, that's fine. But, have we gotten to the point where you can just write off people? Ultimately, they bite back, and I think Kimmel will see that in his ratings eventually, and as we all know, in TV, that's what counts.
Meanwhile, some criticism of the media from a member of the media, Michael Goodwin, who calls himself a liberal, wrote this in his latest column. He says, thanks to the battle over the memo, that's the Nunes memo, we also know with 100% certainty that the mainstream media is part of the swamp. The efforts by the New York Times and the Washington Post, among others, to keep the memo from ever seeing sunshine were appalling. Before it saw the memo, the Times editorial page called it proof of the Republican plot against the FBI. A Washington Post columnist warned President Trump he would be making a historic mistake in releasing it. Now, Judy, I'm going to go to you first because you did say before this memo came out that you were concerned about it releasing sources and methods. Did it do that?
Well, I don't think that it did, but it's, John, it's very hard to know that. What we do know is that the FBI said that the memo wasn't accurate. You could expect them to say that since it's critical of the FBI. But even Trey Gowdy said that it did not show what Donald Trump said it showed, which is vindication of him. Look, I think we've gotten to the stage now where things are so partisan that a grandstanding show like this really distracts us from what the committee, what Robert Mueller is supposed to be looking at, which is to what extent did the Russians interfere in our election? And I think this is a very sad state of affairs. Now the Democrats want their response to the Republican memo released. I think that ought to happen. But this is all a sideshow.
And it could happen. Perhaps, those wheels will get turning later today. Joe, it's interesting right now. There's that movie, The Post, about the Washington Post and the New York Times uncovering government secrets. But as Michael pointed out, they were sort of advocating maintaining government secrets prior to the release of the Nunes memo.
Right. Highly secretive Pentagon papers around the Vietnam War for people who haven't seen The Post. Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep. It's supposedly an excellent movie. I plan on seeing it soon. I quote Kimberly Strassel. She's from the Wall Street Journal, and she says this: having been in journalism all my life, have never seen the press corps fight so hard against transparency. And, yes, we want to know if Russians obviously meddled in our election. We do know they did. We do know that the DNC and the Clinton campaign did pay a foreign agent to obtain information from the Russians to put into a dossier that was later presented to a judge under false pretenses, not explaining exactly the political ramifications behind it, to secure a FISA warrant. That is what we know right now, yet we barely hear anything about that side of the story.
First ladies. And they have now unveiled the pictures for Barack and Michelle Obama. So here is the picture of Barack Obama. You see it there on the left. Okay, there is Barack Obama, and he is actually sitting there in a chair that's apparently covered by leaves. He's getting poison ivy. He's being eaten by this like little shop of horrors. He's actually being eaten by the foliage and looking very serious. And of course, this immediately made me think of Homer Simpson backing into the bushes. That is not, of course, the best version of this. Shoshana Weissman over on Twitter had the best version of this portrait. Here's what it looked like. Yeah, there it is. So there's Barack Obama just sitting there in the bushes. It makes perfect sense because the truth is that aside from Obama's talk, the president of the United States was not a particularly useful guy, particularly on foreign policy. He did not forward the ball on foreign policy. He sort of sat there while people got slaughtered in Syria, sat there while Iran developed a nuclear program, sat there while Israel was under siege, sat there during the Arab Spring, sat there as riots happened in major American cities. So I think it's actually a pretty good likeness of President Obama. I think that's not a bad portrait of the president. It's so funny. They're always saying we have to do something creative with the portrait. It's very important we do something creative. So the artists said something about how we wanted to show that Obama's presidency was he the form figure or was he just being swallowed by history? Was he the driver of history or was he just a representative of it? And then apparently the various flowers here signify flowers from Kenya and flowers from Hawaii and flowers from Chicago. I don't know what the flower from Chicago is. I assume that it's the opium poppy. But the idea that Barack Obama is sitting there in Wrigley's ivy, in Wrigley Field's ivy, is really weird. He's a Sox fan, supposedly. He's not really a Sox fan, by the way. One of my pet peeves, as I've mentioned many times over, I am a true White Sox fan. Barack Obama could not name one single player on the White Sox when he was interviewed during his 2008 presidential run. Yeah, real fan he is. Okay, so that was the picture of Obama. That one was getting mocked pretty relentlessly. That one is not the worst. The worst one is of Michelle. So here's the picture of Michelle Obama. Okay, does that look anything like Michelle Obama? Of course it doesn't look like anything like Michelle Obama. It looks like Regina King, right, the actress. It doesn't look like Michelle Obama at all. And so people were making fun of this. People were getting a big kick out of the fact that the portraits don't look like anything. So naturally, all the lefties came out defending the portraits. They're not supposed to look like the people, they said. Really, this was one of the lines. That these portraits are supposed to be artistic. They're not just supposed to look like the people. Well, then why don't you just put a Kandinsky up there? Right? Now, why don't you just put a Jackson Pollock up there? Just be like a splash of paint and say, this represents Michelle Obama. That doesn't look like anything like Michelle Obama. This is one of my favorite things in the world, by the way, is when people do terrible portraits and terrible statues. As you will recall, I am a huge fan of the Cristiano Ronaldo statue, one of my favorite statues of all time, where he looks like a demented demon sent from hell to torment people. There's a statue of Harry Carey that's just spectacular outside Wrigley Field, where it looks like there are a bunch of faces that are clawing their way out of Hades in order to be lectured about the fortunes of the Cubs by Harry Carey. There's a great one of Walter Johnson, where they tried to make it look like his arm was in motion, and instead it just looks like hell spawn, because his arm is actually like coming out of his body in 5 different ways. It's pretty spectacular. This one ranks pretty high up there. It's like the Lucille Ball statue that looks nothing like Lucille Ball. So well done, National Portrait Gallery. And congratulations again to Regina King for her portrait being entered into the National Gallery. It's very exciting. Congratulations to Homer Simpson as well for being hidden in that picture of Barack Obama. So all of that is very exciting. So in less wonderful news, it now turns out that the Trump administration wants to spend oodles and oodles and oodles of money. So today they offered their budget plan. It is a $4.4 trillion budget plan. Yes, indeed you do. $4.4 trillion. That means it carries nearly $1 trillion deficit each of the next few years. Just awesome. I remember when we were the party of fiscal responsibility. Yeah, that lasted for 5 seconds. One of the fun things about being a Republican, apparently, is you get to scream about fiscal responsibility until the point you get elected, at which point you just blow out the spending. So according to the Washington Post, President Trump on Monday was going to offer this budget plan. It falls far short of eliminating the government's deficit over 10 years, conceding that huge tax cuts and new spending increases make this goal unattainable, 3 people familiar with the proposal said. Eliminating the budget deficit over 10 years has been a North Star for the Republican Party for several decades, and GOP lawmakers took the government to the brink of default in 2011, demanding a vote on an amendment to the Constitution that would prohibit the federal government from spending more than it takes in. That was something that Democrats used to back, too. Now it turns out everybody's a liar. House Speaker Paul Ryan, who's a fiscal conservative, supposedly, when he used to chair the House Budget Committee, routinely proposed tax and spending outlines that would eliminate the deficit over 10 years, even though critics said that this would lead to a severe curtailment in government programs, because in order for you to actually fix the programs, that means that you have to restructure Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. Instead, we're actually expending Medicaid, we're expanding Medicare, and we're expanding Social Security, apparently, in the new budget. In 2013, Paul Ryan proposed $4.6 trillion in cuts over 10 years, an amount he said was sufficient to eliminate the deficit. Those changes were not adopted by Congress or supported by the Obama administration. But now, It turns out Republicans don't care after all. How exciting. They've now jettisoned goals like this since Trump took office. Trump's budget plan calls for a range of spending cuts, reducing the growth of the deficit by $3 trillion over 10 years. It would not eliminate the deficit entirely, said people familiar with the proposal. So what exactly does it include? Apparently, it includes a bunch of new spending on infrastructure, particularly. They are now putting forth a $1.5 trillion infrastructure budget that would include $200 billion of American taxpayer money being spent on infrastructure. One of the things that's always puzzled me about this infrastructure argument is why not just devolve it to the states? Why not make it California's responsibility to do upkeep on its own roads? The idea that you needed a national highway structure, that you needed Eisenhower's national highway system, is not true, and hardcore libertarians will tell you this. The fact is that Route 66, I've said this before on the program, Route 66, which Nat King Cole used to sing about, right? Get your kicks on Route 66. That used to be a thing because it was a state highway connected with another state highway. Then we built the interstate highway system. And the interstate highway system supposedly made travel that much more convenient, but it made all of these towns ghost towns because they were no longer serving state interests. They were now serving supposedly federal interests. It was a boondoggle. We spent an awful lot of money on the national highway system. Listen, I enjoy driving on the highways as much as the next guy, but the idea that it wouldn't have existed without states is just not true. There are state highway systems, and they just would have connected to one another. So where are these cuts supposed to take place? Well, the budget is expected to target spending cuts at social welfare programs like Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. And that's SNAP. That's food stamps. The White House is looking at ways to curb these programs by expanding work requirements for beneficiaries. It's unclear how much changes like this would actually spend. And then there's spending increases as well. $200 billion in federal funds, I mentioned, for the infrastructure plan. $23 billion for border security and immigration enforcement. None of that's going to happen. $85.5 billion for veterans programs. $13 billion over the next 2 years to combat the opioid epidemic. If you want to combat the opioid epidemic, then you actually should curb Medicaid. One of the big problems that they've had is that everywhere that Medicaid has expanded, opioid addiction has expanded because Medicaid actually covers the ability to get cheap opioid painkillers. There have been several studies that have been done on this particular point. Bottom line is that Trump is blowing out the budget. Now, the media's coverage of this is always really interesting because they suggest that this is the end of the world, that he's blowing out the budget. Okay, first of all, this budget is not going to pass. Second of all, the Democrats used to routinely propose budgets like this, just as big, and the media never covered it this way. The media always covered these budget-busting budgets as something fine and decent. It's never a big deal. They're going to spend as much as they possibly can. No biggie at all. It's still not good for Republicans that we are proposing this kind of spending.